Hi, thanks for joining me on this session as we talk about using Azure Managed Identities. Before I start, I'd just like to give a shout out to Dwayne for organising and supporting this session. I think it's a great initiative. What you'll need to go through this with me is your own Azure subscription, with you preferably with owner rights on that subscription. You'll need to know a little bit about APIs, a little bit about PowerShell, and not a lot else. So a little bit about me first. My name is Darren Robinson. I've been in the industry for 30 odd years, so I've seen quite a bit of change during that time. I'm a principal consultant with Bell Integration. I've done all sorts of jobs in the past, some technical and some not so technical. My contact details are up on the Azure Back to School website, so if you'd like to get in touch, it'd be great to hear from you. So just give me a shout on Twitter or LinkedIn. I look forward to hearing from you. So what are the goals of this session? So the first goal is to introduce you to managed identities. The second goal really is to look at the two different types of managed identity and some of the use cases for those. It's not exhaustive. This is really just an introductory session. Following that, we're going to do a demo where we will assign a system assigned managed identity to a virtual machine. We'll grant that identity scope to the resource group that the virtual machine sits in, and then we'll read some metadata from that resource group. So this is what we'll be going through is a Microsoft tutorial. It's online. When we get to that point in the presentation, I'll share the link with you, and then you'll be able to follow along. So the real goal here is to just give people a overview of this subject. I know it's confused me in the past. And if I've not worked on managed identities for a while, I go back and look at them, and sometimes it's a little bit confusing. You have to spend a bit of time putting everything in its place and understanding when to use which type of identity, etc. Okay, so what are they? Managed identities provide an identity for applications to use when connecting to resources that support AAD authentication. So that's the Microsoft description. So identities can be used to authenticate many cloud services or applications that support Azure AD authentication, and as long as they support some form of authorization as well. So an example is if I've got a managed identity on my virtual machine, and I'd have that because my virtual machine wants to access another resource. And if I wanted to access storage, as long as I've got that managed identity that's associated with the virtual machine, as long as that managed identity has got a role and has got the necessary RBAC rights to access that storage account, then I can use that identity to authenticate to the storage and then perhaps read or write to the storage. So that's essentially what managed identities are used for at a very, very high level. Okay, so why do we need them? So we need managed identities because secure communication between cloud services is an absolute must. It is essential. So we're talking about things such as communication between a database and its underlying storage. It might be between a stack of services that make up a web app. And they might need to talk to Key Vault, for example, to extract passwords securely, and those sorts of things. The second reason why we might want to use them is because managing identities there's a significant overhead with that that most people don't want to do. They've got better things to be doing with their times than creating identities, assigning identities, revoking identities, rotating keys for identities, and then obviously having to remember to delete the identities at the end of the life cycle. So that's one of the main reasons why we need them. And the other one is really managing privileged accounts such as identities, principals, service accounts, those sorts of resources, is extremely risky. So if you don't use them, then you can end up in a situation where you're retaining, recording connection strings in files. Those files can be checked into GitHub or another version control system, etc. Or you might have usernames and passwords that are passed between staff because they need to do something urgently. So there's obviously a huge risk with that, and managed identities and indeed service principals that allow us to get around those sorts of problems, which is fantastic. So if we talk about the two different types of managed identities, the first are system assigned managed identities. So when they are enabled on a resource, an identity is created in Azure AD, and that is bound to the resource that the identity was enabled on. And it's worth noting as well that a managed identity is in fact a service principal. So some of the nuances regarding system assigned managed identities, and we will look at system user assigned shortly. So a system assigned managed identity has a one-to-one relationship with the resource, or there's a one-to-one relationship between the resource and the identity. So if I have a resource, I talked about a VM before, I've got the VM, I enable the system assigned managed identity on that resource, and that managed identity cannot be used on another resource. It's tied to that virtual machine, and because it's tied to that virtual machine, it's the life cycle of that managed identity is also tied to the virtual machine as well. So they're bound to the same life cycle. So what that means is when you delete the resource, the virtual machine, for example, that service, then the managed identity is deleted at the same time. So that can be very useful if you've worked in an environment before where there are lots of identities that have been created over time. It can get out of control, and then obviously you've increased your attack surface, etc. So that's really system assigned. That's the first one we're looking at. The second one we look at is user assigned managed identities. So user assigned managed identities they're an independent identity, and they've got their own life cycle. So what happens is you create the managed identity yourself, the user assigned managed identity. That identity can be used by multiple resources. So again, if you've got a full stack of web components, maybe a multi-tier application, so you've got a web layer, you've got an application layer, you've got a database layer, and they all want to access Key Vault to extract sensitive information, then they can all use the same user assigned managed identity. That you couldn't do that with a system assigned managed identity, because that has the one-to-one relationship. So with a user assigned managed identity, you can have one identity that can be shared by multiple resources. So you could also have a large number of virtual machines, for example, 30 virtual machines. The password for the virtual machine is stored within a Key Vault, and that all those virtual machines could use the same user assigned managed identity. So those are the differences between those two. I'm sure you'll have heard of service principals. If you log into the portal in Azure and you type in service principal, the first thing you'll see is that enterprise applications is brought up in Azure Active Directory. So a security identity is actually a representation of an application. It's very much like a service account in the old days on premises. So we would create a service account, and that service account would be used for some privileged function. Hugely problematic, very risky, as I'm sure a lot of people will remember. So anyway, the service principal, its tokens are used to authenticate and authorize apps, services, and tools to access Azure resources, as long as the organization is using Azure Active Directory. Now, whereas we'll talk about the differences in a short while, but it's worth noting here that service principals can be used for authorizing external resources, and that's not the case with managed identities. So service principals still really useful, although there's a larger overhead of using them. I just wanted to touch on that. We're really talking about managed identities in this session. So if we just look at this table here, and we do a comparison between them, if we look at service principals first, so service principal, the use case there is authentication and integration of third parties, as I just said. So, and this isn't an exhaustive list, but if you think about it as far as authenticating and authorizing third-party applications and services to access your resources in Azure, that's when you might create a service account. So there's an overhead with the management of the life cycle of that service principal, the creation, assignment, rotation, revoking the service principal and deleting it, etc. So that can be quite complex, and it comes back to whoever's doing this has probably got better things that they'd rather be getting on with than managing accounts. When we look at a system assigned managed identity, that's used for authentication between Azure resources, and as I mentioned before, the identity expires with the resource. Now, the consideration there is that you've got a one-to-one relationship between the system assigned managed identity and the resource that it's created on. So it's only used for that identity, which may or may not be a good thing, depending on the scenario that you have. Now, it's worth noting as well that the identity and the resource granting access that you're granting access to must be within the same AD tenant. And then with the user assigned managed identity, just going over that one more time. So again, it's used for authentication between Azure resources. And it's got a one-to-many relationship between the resources. So you can have one user assigned managed identity that can actually be assigned to multiple resources and used to access something like a key vault. So again, the same as the system assigned managed identity, the identity and the resource that you're granting access to must be within the same AD tenant, and we'll go over this shortly. And again, it's a standalone resource and it's got its own life cycle. Great. Let's move on. Okay, so in a moment we'll be going through the demo, but I just wanted to share with you details of the demo that we'll be going through. So you can see the name of the demo there. If you search for that on the net, you'll find the same demo. Alternatively, there's the fully qualified URL. So take a quick look at that. So what we'll So shortly we'll log on to the virtual machine that we've just created with the system assigned managed identity. But I just thought I'd take a moment just to make sure that to clarify and make sure everybody understands we're on the same page, make sure everybody understands what we've done so far. So we started by creating the virtual machine. And when we created the virtual machine, we created we ticked the box to make sure a system assigned managed identity was created with it. So that system assigned managed identity, as we discussed before, is bound to that virtual machine. So at that point, we've just got a virtual machine in the managed identity. It doesn't have any authorization to access any other resources. So then we went to the resource group. So this is the resource that we want to access using the managed identity. We went to the resource group, and on the IAM blade on the resource group, we checked identity access and access management, and we added a role assignment. And the role assignment we added on the resource group was for the virtual machine managed identity. So managed identity 1, that was our managed identity. We granted that the RBAC role of reader, and the scope was granted to the actually to the resource group resource. So I just wanted to make sure that was clear before we go on and we access the virtual machine and do the last part of the demo from within the virtual machine, and we go through the activity to make a call to the resource group. So using the RDP file that we've downloaded, I've logged on to the virtual machine. I already have a copy of the instructions here. So these instructions, you'll find these at the link that I gave you in an earlier slide for the tutorial. So the first thing we're going to do is, well, the first thing to explain is that what we're going to do is we're making a call. We're making a call from within the virtual machine using the system assigned managed identity that is assigned, which is bound to the virtual machine, and we're going to make a call to the resource group on which we have given authorization for that managed identity to read information at that scope level. So let's go through it. So the first command we're going to execute is going to make a request to the local managed identity on the ARM endpoint to get an access token. So let's just copy this command. Don't worry too much about the detail here of what these are doing. You can look into this later if you want more information. Okay, so let's just look at response and look at that initial call that we've made. So this, we should have got the access token. We've got some other information that we don't want. So what we're going to do now is we're going to pull the full response and actually put it into an object called content. So a variable there. Let's just run that and let's take a look at the moment. There we go. Okay, so that's looking better. So we've pulled the access token out there. But we've still got some other data in there that we don't want. And finally, this last command pulls into an object called ARM token. It just pulls in access token from that content object. So let's just did I not? Perhaps I didn't copy that. I can type it in. No, let's copy it again. Okay, let's take a look at the ARM token. Okay, so now what we've got in this object is we've just got the access token. So let me clear the screen. So in the final command, there's a couple of things that I've got to do. So we're going to use the invoke web request commandlet again to make a call to ARM. So we're doing so obviously within the VM, as I mentioned, and we'll include the access token in the header. Excuse me there. So I just need to go back and just change a couple of things here. So I've got my subscription ID that I need to enter. That needs to be specific to your own subscription. I need to do the same, and also the resource group. So the resource group I can remember. So that was back to school RG, I believe. Now let me just go back to my Azure subscription. Copy that. Go back to my session. Hopefully this will copy in okay. Good stuff. Right, so I'm going to copy this command. Now, if this command successfully executes, then that means I've successfully used the system assigned managed identity that is bound to the VM, and it does. So here we can see some metadata from the resource group, including location, the properties, etc. So just a simple demonstration there that I hope's helped to demonstrate some of the power and some of the way that the managed identities can be used. There's far more ways that you can use them. We'll continue on to the summary now. So I'd just like to say thanks very much if you're still with me at this point, and thanks very much to Dwayne once again for putting on Azure Back to School and doing all the good organisation around it. Please do reach out and contact me on Twitter at St Albans Stas, and hopefully look forward to catching you on the online community. Thanks very much. Bye bye.